Nice. Hello there. Let's continue Ineptius's tale in Rumblings of Remardan, my first fantasy novel, on Chapter 2, Home. Ineptius looked up from his earthen mounds around the potatoes that were growing. After passing out and seeing that vision, he had taken a break from planting his potatoes. The strange vision still caught in his mind. Ineptius had learned as a boy about how the dwarves had continued to conquer the north until they ran into the more civilized kingdoms on its borders. At that point, the stories go that they had held back and were still biding their time against those who would stand in opposition to their great dwarven kingdom. Ineptius's father was still out there working in the fields, understanding that his son had these sorts of episodes from time to time. He told Ineptius not to speak about these things to others. The king was always on the prowl with his Isheki, a group of a rather untasteful bunch. They were feared dwarven hunters of magic who ripped people away from their families in order to sequester them off for training in their lord's army at the academy for magic users. Ineptius had fallen asleep in his haste to forget these possibilities that represented horror to him. He woke up now, upon the gruff entrance of his father returning from the fields. His mother had already cooked a hearty dinner of potato stew in that large cast iron pot strewn across the fireplace. Ineptius' brother, Alius, still had not returned from wherever it was he was at. Alius was lucky in the fact that only Ineptius had worked in the fields this day. Maybe tomorrow, Ineptius would do the same, find some way to shirk his duties. But that wasn't him, though. He was a rather lazy dwarf, but still had a fair sense of diligence built into those solid bones of his. If a good excuse came up, then of course he would take the opportunity as it was presented to him to leave. But if not, then he would not fabricate a reason to not work in the fields. There was no reason why he shouldn't work along with the rest of his family, and the other human serfs, of course, who worked the land. After the dwarves had taken over, they all retired to live lives of luxury, lording with those long-lasting lives and wealth over the serfs, who were now made up of almost entirely humans. Ineptius' family was strange in this aspect of their life. For many generations they had been forced to work as serfs for their evil overlord. No one exactly knew why they were one of the only dwarven households to toil, sun up and sun down, for the growing of their crops, but rumors always abounded, and it was feared that their petty tyrant still held some secret knowledge of the origins of where their downfall came. The percentage of food that was requisitioned from them was anywhere between 50 and 75% of their potatoes and cabbage crops that they managed to scrape out of the earth every season. There were times when the family had to go from day to day hungry, almost starving. In order to even work in the fields, they could barely drag the hoe across the dirt because they were so hungry. Of course, this then only led to harder times for the family. It was a vicious cycle. You didn't create enough food, and you barely had any food for yourself. But now was all right. No extra burdens from the taxation of their lord was placed on them. He took simply half of what they produced. It was explained away that this was to safeguard against times of famine for the lord's fiefdom. Of course, they never saw a sign of the food when those times came around. The dwarves that were present all sat around for a family meal. "Ah, that stew looks nice," Eneptius' father said in a satisfied tone. His mother moved around frantically, still filling bowls for them, setting out wooden spoons on the table when she had a chance. His mother smiled as she did this, a kind woman, always fussing over every minute detail. I managed to get a jug of milk from the neighbors, his mother said with a rather firm delight. Which ones? His father quickly interjected. It mattered sincerely to Roloff which neighbors they had gotten it from. The other human serfs were not at all welcoming to these dwarves who had long lives to live. But they only lived in service of their master, and so it was a long life filled with suffering and toil. At least the humans had short lives, full of suffering and toil. The family did not know how long it had been since they were the ones tending the land as serfs, along with the humans. There was only the untimely deaths of their forebears to mark the shift in generations and the turning of the seasons. Eneptius' father, Roloff, did not talk much about his father or any of his predecessors, or even talk at all, as a matter of fact. The Bohemians traded me for a pair of my knitted gloves, Eneptius' mother, Ruda, stated in a nonchalant tone. She often sat at home and knitted, while the men worked in the great outdoors, scrabbling up their livelihood. Then, trading these articles of clothing to the various others in their village for goods and favors. They're all right folk, but I wouldn't trust any of these humans as far as I can throw 'em, Roloff said, and took a spoonful of soup longingly after such a long day of work. Come on, dear. These people are our friends. Don't worry so much, Ruda responded quickly. She was used to this mistrustful sentiment from her husband. Not many humans there were always so kind to them, even kind enough to do a trade that benefited them so much. Knitted gloves for a mug of milk? Who wouldn't take that? It was a welcome change to the usual stares and splitting of wood that tended to happen whenever the family met others. And the other humans always tended to spit whenever they came around these dwarven serfs. Yeah, we'll see what happens the next time the Gersog shows up to inflict his will on us. He always seemed to find new ways of doing damage, the old man said. Roloff's eyes were knitted in consternation at the mistreatment their family had gone through throughout their generations. The two parents noticed Eneptius had moved from his slumber. He stretched long, the wooden planks having done a real harm to his back. He yawned widely, scratching his grown orange beard in annoyance to something that he hoped was not fleas. He then went on to examine the grime that had built up underneath his fingernails. Nothing there besides dirt, so that was a good sign. The warmth of the fire spread out in glistening joy as he went to take a seat upon a sturdily built wooden stool. There was no respite for his back, however, as there was nothing for him to rest it on. Roloff and Ruda looked at him with double concern spread across their faces. Eneptius' mother was the first to speak. Some more bad nightmares? He rubbed his hands into his eyes while he yawned again, and caught the yawn with his hand right before it was finished. Yeah, Mom. I don't know what it could be. This time I saw... His father interrupted him at that moment. Keep it to yourself, son, and don't be frightening us with that sort of talk. We've got enough troubles as is without whatever nonsense you're spewing this time. Don't be so hard on him. When's the last time anything he said got us into trouble? She was concerned for her child. Roloff could be downright mean at some points to their children. Ruda sometimes had the creeping thought that this was why Alias always seemed to be away from home. Roloff spoke gruffly. It's not about the last time, and I know you remember that. They exchanged furtive glances. It's about what'll happen next time, when the Isheki show up to take him. So keep it to yourself, Eneptius, or I'll give you a sample of how they treat those Koldun, the mages. Everyone was silent at that point. Eneptius had an idea of what that sample might be from his father's tone. Roloff never seemed to beat his children, but there was always that hidden thread of violence, which could be sensed in his interactions with the two boys. After several minutes of silence, Eneptius was the one who spoke up. "Mom, can I get some of that stew?" "Oh, I'm sorry. I nearly forgot that you hadn't eaten yet," Ruta said as she went about getting another bowl and spoon for Eneptius. After she poured him some, she placed it in front of him with a smile and sat down to start on eating again. Eneptius said, "Thanks, Mom. It looks good." "That looked good." Roloff had continued feeding himself the creamy potato soup and focusing intently upon it, as though the thing might sprout legs and run away. The smell of the soup was enough to bring birds from the village to come sit outside their humble window. Ruta was no chef, but she could make simple things decently well enough. A few carrots and onion grass combined with a little garlic, plus the potatoes and cream made for a very tasty soup. Eneptius looked in the direction of his dad and asked, "How's the planting going?" Roloff finished his bowl. "It's not so bad. Even though it's colder than most years, potatoes are a hardy crop. Like us, they'll survive these frosts that are coming on. Just have to make sure that we keep the snows off of them." "That shouldn't be too hard, right, Dad?" Eneptius genuinely wasn't sure about this year. No matter how many times he had worked out there in the fields, he always seemed to get something wrong. Then Roloff would turn to his mother, like he was doing at this time, and say, "I'm not raising incompetent retards, am I?" "No, you're not, Dad. I just want to be sure." Eneptius answered for her, "We haven't had it this bad in a while, and I can't remember things so well." "You know that." Roloff knew that certainly. But still, he went back to eating, leaving this conversation to hang in the air, and Eneptius's question to go unanswered for the time being. Finally, his mother was the one who decided to break the silence this time. "How did you sleep?" "Not so good, Mom. My head still hurts. I really wish there was something we could do about it." Eneptius turned his head suddenly in the direction of the rudimentary window. "Hey, it's getting pretty late. Where's Alias?" Both parents looked down at the table with a rather glum expression on their faces. Roloff spoke first. "You know where he is." "No, I don't," replied Eneptius, with an unknowing look plastered on his face. "I'm confused. Where is he?" Roloff took the time to respond at least. "He's at one of those meetups again. Alice never could stay away from the shiny things, and with this traveling show, he's always away with strangers now." "It's not fair," cried Eneptius. "I'm always the one at home who has to do all the chores, and he's always running off somewhere. Can't you make him stay at home?" Roloff's stew was getting cold, so he quickly finished the rest of it, and responded, "What am I supposed to do? You want me to throw your brother out? You want me to trap you both here like prisoners? I can't do anything while you two have legs to move on, and I'm not about to get rid of your legs." Silence reigned again, as it often did in the Sikirden household. No one had a response to this, and no one cared enough to argue past his resolute response. There were things better left unsaid anyway, and that's normally how this family of dwarves lived, each one inside their own heads. So, pray tell, what was happening in Eneptius's mind? Well, his head hurt to begin with. There was always a dull, nagging pain that kept going on in the back corners of his head. His eyes always felt like they had salt placed into the very back of them, where he could not successfully take the pieces out. This was probably caused by the lack of sleep the young dwarf always seemed to suffer, and this, in turn, was due to the nightmares that plagued him, or the noises he thought he heard throughout the night. Anything that might cause his hard soul to shudder at 4:48 in the morning. Of course, his father would wake Eneptius, and Alius, if he was there, at the crack of dawn anyways. But this didn't stop him from waking up several times beforehand, to only find things to have been false alarms. And what was Eneptius's mind saying at this point in his life, as he sat at the table with his parents? He often thought about his place in the world. Eneptius was a strict follower of Gorgonus, the dwarven god. So was his family, except for maybe Roloff. But who's to say what really lay in that man's heart? His father personified the rules of life that were set out by Gorgonus. Live modestly, be hardy, gruff, don't talk too much, and uphold the faith from non-believers. These were just some of the commands given down to the dwarves by their god. Roloff had never strictly said that he believed in Gorgonus, but he lived in a seemingly model life to the god. He saw the way that the dwarven nobility never seemed to live up to the standards, but still, he followed them, though without going to any of the services held by the priesthood. On the other hand, the rest of his family was very pious in observing the various commemorative days to honor Gorgonus. Ruda often stated that she had received spiritual guidance directly from their god. Eneptius was apt to believe her in these things, as he considered these visions that he had to be from the king of dwarves himself. He always thought that the god was trying to communicate something to him. And so Eneptius went after infidels and heretics as hard and often as he was able to, which, to be honest, wasn't very often. Mostly he tried not to associate with those who did not believe. There were humans who even thought that Gorgonus was there for them also. Eneptius agreed in this respect, and tried to convince the other people in the village to come to the faith. It was a sorry sight to see him arguing with an elder about the benefits of becoming a grogman, which is one who follows Gorgonus, of course. These people religiously followed the ideals which were talked about by the various priests. There were those who even gave up their lives in dedication to Gorgonus, the Grogonauts. And these people went to the various villages in Remardan, fighting to defend the serfs from bandits or monsters and the like. All they asked in return were some daily libations and a place to lay their head. Eneptius often thought about running away to join these Grogonauts. It would create a much welcome break in the utter monotony of life. Getting up and planting crops, then taking care of them day in and day out, with the interspersed pounding in his head and pain behind his eyes that seemed a constant struggle for him to make it throughout the day. For some reason, Eneptius thought that by doing something out of the normal, by just getting out of there, things would become better. A voice always popped up into the back of his mind, saying, "I have to get out of this place. I must escape." Then the same voice, just in a different, much more friendly tone, would say, "And what are you going to do once you leave? How will it be any different? If you're miserable here, where you have most things, then how will you feel when you have nothing?" These spoken dialogues in his head did not happen constantly, but they happened enough where he was concerned about it. That, coupled with his visions, often made a different voice turn on and ask, "Am I going insane?" But, as his father had taught him, Eneptius just bottled it up somewhere in his mind and placed it on a labeled shelf titled Misgivings. All three had finished dinner by now, and Ruta was in the midst of doing the dishes as she cleaned what little bits were still left in the bowls. She was having a rather good time of it, too. Roloff said, "Thank you. It was pretty good. Just be careful about who you're making deals with." Eneptius parroted his father's statement. "Yeah, Mom. Watch out for those Hume scum." Ruta just ignored them and continued scrubbing. Roloff added another log to the fire and settled down into their bed. Ruta went to join him soon afterwards. Eneptius stayed up a bit longer, just watching the flames dance upon the logs, in both serious and jovial shapes. After about half an hour, he finally settled down on his roll next to the life-giving heat. The young dwarf slept on his side, closely knitting his eyes together in order to prevent the light from reaching in and waking him up. When Eneptius woke up this time, he tried to stay asleep. He didn't want to move out of a position that had found him in so nice and comfortable a place. Eventually, he just had to get up, to find that the light emanating from the fire wasn't nearly so bright as it started out at, and the warmth afforded to him by the threadbare sheets did not seem to stand up to the test of the cold outside. He packed in another log and watched the flames embroil it, and then he moved towards the door of the hut. Eneptius was wearing a long brown tunic and placed on his worn felt shoes to take a walk outside and relieve himself. The night was cold. A wind blew the birch trees of the forest into various frightening shapes. Wolves howled off in the distance. There was a distinct shudder that ran itself through Eneptius's body. He had no idea what this could mean. Perhaps bad tales for the future. Most likely it was just the cold, though. Alias still wasn't back from wherever his parents had alluded to. It was annoying. Eneptius cared about his brother, like any sibling would, but in a much more detached way. When they were even younger, Alias and his Hume friends had beaten up Eneptius on multiple occasions for what seemed to Eneptius no reason. The young dwarf merely wanted to be able to sleep in a blanket and with a pillow, but of course those bullies wouldn't let him in peace. They needed all the blankets and pillows for themselves, and so they took him. Eneptius tried to resist at first, but it was futile. Alias was much stronger and skinnier and angrier, which was all unusual for a dwarf, so he had the clear advantage. That, coupled with the numbers of his two other friends there, made it so that Eneptius had to just curl up into a ball to protect himself. The younger brother had tried calling for help to his parents, who were in the next room over, but at the time, it was to no avail. Roloff and Ruta must have been sleeping through his cries, or, as was assumed by Eneptius, those two just outright ignored him. And things seemed to line up just right to reinforce this idea. Eneptius brought it up to them, but they stated that it was just boys being boys, and he should let it go. Of course, Eneptius could not and would not let it go. A grievous slight had been done to both his dignity and honor that day. However much Eneptius believed and followed Gorgonus, he would not be able to be a totally straightforward and honest dwarf in everything he did. This young one had a real penchant for plotting and sneaking that would have made any outside observer try to recommend that either he enter the higher services of Remardan's secret police, or he should be locked away by those police himself. Right now, however, it was a bitter night wind that rustled the slightly distant trees outside their village. It must have been very late, for there were no lights except from the paltry castle that made up their Gersog's living place. How the overlord of Atrodnai must have lived. At least he could afford to stay safe, protected by his Reitzers. They did a downright despicable job for the serfs, but that's another issue entirely. Aniptius had gotten an extra coat in the meantime, and was now simply letting his eyes adjust to the darkness that pervaded the night sky. He was a bit used to this series of events by now. Hand goes out to the right and follows the door onto the hard birch that made up the outside of the hut. Next, just walk a little bit more. Remember, carefully measured out steps. 1, 2, all the way up to 15. Once he was at the back of the hut, he did his business with utter determination. The cold made it a bit difficult at first, but then that nice rush of warmth and... What was that? A noise was heard, and not the normal ones of urine hitting the soft patches of snow. In some circumstances, Aniptius always complained about his lack of hearing, but this was not one of those circumstances. His ears immediately went out to find the signal that he had picked up on, that rather noticeable, and now at least sound of scraping. It was almost like a man was closely shaving himself, though his cheeks seemed to flap at the end of every scrape. There's a saying, you know, Groganus laughs at plans, and this was one of those times. Aniptius's senses lit up. Anything was possible now. His mind raced with the utter uncertainties of what that noise could be. There was a gray that now engulfed his field of vision. Something long and slender emerged out of the darkness. He couldn't make out what it was exactly, though he knew it was something that shouldn't be too dangerous. Those sorts of creatures attacked first and asked questions second. This thing, however, was a spindly and uncouth creature, about the length and height of a branch maybe. There seemed to be no arms associated with it on either sides, or legs really, but as it moved the thing seemed to split apart in the bottom to form two separate sticks with which it walked. The only reason it engulfed Aniptius's view was because he focused so intensely on it. Otherwise the thing seemed not to be wide, but rather quite tall. It had strange, bright green eyes that stood out forward from its body. Warily it looked at Aniptius. For some reason he wasn't intimidated by this creature. Until it talked, that is. There was a low hiss that came from it, though it didn't seem to have any sort of mouth with which it moved at the varying pronunciation of words that tumbled from its strange, stick-like senses. It wasn't a slippery hiss. In fact, it was more of a whisper than anything. Strange, considering that Aniptius had never heard nor seen anything like this thing before. In a clearly southern accent, one with a very rolling drawl, this creature said, "Who are you?" It was such an unexpected question that Aniptius wasn't able to respond, besides putting his member away, of course, which he had quite forgotten to do in his shock at whatever this thing was. "There ain't no midges round here. All them live up in them coal buildings." That same voice lunged out again. It was even weirder than in all his life and all his various ancestors' lives. And Aniptius had never encountered nor even heard a story about anything like this. And the way it spoke. Sure, he had known some people to talk like this, who had come up from Capistonia to the south. But this was just utterly bizarre. The bewildered dwarf quickly did what was necessary to do, then went on to stutter and say, "Aniptius, sir." The stick creature's eyes moved about separately, with both of them looking him up and down. They were now orange. "Aniptius, sir." I ain't never seen you round these parts. Maybe you knew. Becoming less afraid, but still quite terrified, the dwarf said, Ineptius, that's my name. Just Ineptius. And I've lived here my whole life. Same for my parents, and theirs going back as long as anyone can remember. This time the creature looked him straight in the eyes. The stick thing towered above him, and so he had to almost crane his neck all the way back, and the stick creature had to do the same towards him. Ain't never seen stunties down here before. You must be a liar. Ineptius was both disarmed and taken aback by this accusation. No, I'm not. I don't lie. And besides, why would I? And there's no point to it. I don't even know who or what you are. It was the thing's turn to take offense. Why, I'm Passenac. Everyone knows me here in Atrana. I'm a Debuna. He stated this last part clearly and proudly, making sure that Ineptius heard perfectly well what he was. And on that final note, the Debuna disappeared. Ineptius was rattled. He hadn't even turned away, and this thing just up and vanished. He had quite forgotten about whatever he had gone out there for now. Ineptius could tell it was getting to be on early, but he desperately hoped for one more hour of sleep before starting the new day. He took the same path back towards the door of the hut. There was just too much to ingest at that time, and he was simply too tired to do anything about it. Ineptius made his way back to the door, and found that it had been open since the last time after he had already closed it upon leaving. It appeared that Alius had made his way back home and stumbled into the bed next to his. Stupid idiot. Needs to close the damn door, Ineptius thought, shaking his head. He quickly went in and closed it as quietly as he could so that he'd not wake anyone up. That was always a motivator for him, trying to avoid uncomfortable situations at most any cost. This is what led the young dwarf to start lying. When he was a child, he often threw temper tantrums, which caused his parents to make or do something to solve whatever he needed. This trait only developed as Ineptius got older, though it wasn't temper tantrums now, but just ever more subtle manipulation, which developed over time. After he was inside, he closed the door and locked it, with the sturdy iron bolt that ran across its hinges. He didn't even bother to remove his overcoat, and only threw off his shoes. The tired and confused dwarf mumbled a prayer to Groganus, and did the sign of a one-sided curved X across his body. Ineptius fell into his role and was thankful of receiving the extra warmth from his blankets and coat. The fire was now only a smolder in the oven next to him. This only made it better to fall asleep. As we all know, he slept better in the cold. The morning arrived as soon as he had expected it, which was too soon. Ineptius wanted and needed more sleep, but that wasn't an option when it came to the daily task of planting potatoes. Roloff woke both the boys that morning, with Alius looking even worse than Ineptius, if that was possible. Sometime in the early morning hours, a light snow had fallen upon their crops, just as their father had predicted. They all went about the task of creating holes and piling up more mounds of earth for the tiny things to get a hold of sunlight. The two dwarven boys worked together side by side, going about their business in anticipation of another boring day of plantings. When there was enough time for a short break, Ineptius turned to his brother and said, "Where have you been?" Alius's voice sounded out in a neatly crisp tone that showed some slice of irritation building up in it. "I was at another meetup. There's a traveler from Capistonia, teaching all sorts of things. Heck, you should come. You might learn a thing or two." "Well, that makes sense," Ineptious thoughts pounded in his head before he responded. You know I don't mess with that stuff. No good comes of it, Alias. Just leave off and plant the fields like the rest of us. They went back to doing just that. It wasn't such hard work, only tedious and cold. They had on the clothing that had been knitted for them by Ruda. There was about a 5-year difference between the two brothers. Oh, come on, these things are like they came from Groganus himself. You should have to see them, Ineptius. You really have to. It'll change your mind when you do. Alius spoke this way to convince the younger dwarf, but he wasn't having it at all. Ineptius simply shook his head and said, I don't even want to hear about it. You know Dad doesn't like it either, so stop trying to drag me into all this nonsense. The mounding was going much better than the convincing, though. With methodical precision, the two brothers continued to work, while their father was overseeing them now. Come on, it's like this. Roloff butted in to pull aside Ineptius's hands and used his own to mound the dirt into an even straighter tower that protected the lowly stalk which sprouted out of the hard soil. I hate this old man. I've been doing it for years now, and still he doesn't trust me. And Ineptius' thoughts continued to pound. He kept silent, however. He simply glowered in his hate right now, without saying a word out loud. Nevertheless, the young dwarf continued on in his work on their little plot of land. Alius was also quickly shown by their father how to properly build these very simple mounds around potatoes. After Roloff moved far away enough, the two brothers started to grumble amongst each other. Alius started first. Why's he always got to do this, Ineptius? We already know how to get it done. Shut up, Alius. There's no point in complaining about it. Ineptius really wasn't having it today. His brother just went back to the planning. Ineptius was very tired after last night. That was an understatement. Luckily, Ineptius hadn't had time yet to think about what had gone on during that night. That was until he got more into a rhythm of moving and planting, moving and planting, moving and planting. One after another, they kept on coming with a seemingly endless supply of potatoes. Then he was able to think to himself, what happened last night? What was that thing? Pasanax. Strange name for a strange creature. I knew I'm going crazy. The dwarf had some free time to think with his hands and body moving along mechanically. He thought on what the thing had said. Then he thought back to the days long ago, the days of his youth. Those seemed carefree enough for him. Just the ever-present purpose set on his family and his family's life. There was no serious threat on them at this point in Remardan's history. The Sikjordan family went about their daily lives as per usual, with the occasional hiccup here and there. And that is the end to chapter 2. And I hope you all enjoyed. And if you did, like, subscribe, share, of course, and stay tuned for the next video. Thank you for watching, or listening.